Well, Douglas Ross, you wanted to keep Boris Johnson away from this campaign. He's not here, but the scandal around him is very much present in Scotland. There are now 3 different news organisations who double-sourced the claim that Boris Johnson said, let the bodies pile high in their thousands with regard to the second lockdown. Do you believe Boris Johnson's denial? Do you stand with him?
Those comments are unacceptable from anyone, whatever level of elected office or any individual at all, and I would never support those comments. But the Prime Minister has said he did not make them. He has been very clear he did not make those comments.
Do you believe him?
Yes. He is someone who was taken into intensive care himself. He saw at first hand what our nurses and doctors had to do to protect lives at the peak of this pandemic. And I believe him when he says he did not make the remarks that have been attributed to him. But I say again, those are appalling, unacceptable remarks.
I mean, he's a man who's been sacked for lying in the past, but you believe him on this?
I believe he did not make those comments.
Nicola Sturgeon, I'm sure you're enjoying this particular scandal, but I mean, you've been accused of being the pot calling the kettle black when it comes to allegations of the stench of sleaze. I mean, can you really take any moral high ground, given the long list of sexual impropriety claims that have come from members of your party?
Look, I was investigated over allegations of breaching the ministerial code, and I was cleared over those allegations. But rightly, given the allegations were made, I was investigated and I was subject to months of intense scrutiny.
I'm talking about all the others, all the people who've had to resign.
When allegations about others come forward, we investigate them, we take appropriate action. In fact, you mentioned Alex Salmond. In some ways, it's because he didn't like the fact that I wouldn't cover up allegations that led to the differences of opinion between us. But I'm staggered by Douglas Ross's, may I say it, hypocrisy here, because when I faced those allegations, he called for my resignation before I'd had any opportunity to even defend myself. Of course, I was subsequently cleared of the allegations against me, and yet he stands here tonight when the allegations are about his own boss. He simply says we've got to accept his word. There is a stench of sleaze around this UK Tory government. They're acting as if the rules only apply to other people and that they and their wealthy friends can act with impunity, make and spend money however they want, and somehow they're untouchable. Well, I think the message for people across Scotland, and indeed in the rest of the UK where there are elections next week, is show them they're not untouchable. And actually, the rules apply to them as well.
Well, you'd like to see Boris Johnson presumably face a day of questioning the way Nicola Sturgeon did.
I am sure there will be investigations and inquiries into all of this. We know with the lobbying situation there are 8 separate inquiries underway, but Nicola Sturgeon says she investigates every single claim against an SNP politician. Can Nicola Sturgeon explain the outcome of the investigation into her disgraced ex-former finance minister, which lasted over a year, and the people of Scotland still don't know what was going on? Nicola?
He's no longer in the SNP.
But he was for a year.
We can't investigate people that are not in the SNP, but Douglas really has to answer for Douglas's modus operandi.
You have to answer for the members of your party.
Sure,
there's been ministers, people in Westminster.
I think anybody watching this will have seen that I have not escaped having to answer for members of my own party.
Derek investigation lasted a year.
But hold on, let me finish this point. Douglas's modus operandi here is that when it's allegations against an opponent, he calls it out and he calls for resignations before they even get the chance to defend themselves. But when it's allegations against his own side, he rushes to their defence. There needs to be a proper, full, comprehensive investigation into all of the allegations, whether it's David Cameron's lobbying, Boris Johnson's text messages, or these disgraceful comments that he's accused of.
Anna Sarwar, I mean, the Labour Party should be profiting from all of this, and you're not. And it's partly because Keir Starmer is not making his voice heard or pinning any of it on anyone.
Look, I don't agree with that, but Christian, to be frank, we deserve better than this. I mean, you saw right at the top of your news report the consequences of when you leave bodies piling, and frankly horrific, the scenes coming from India. And we risked seeing those scenes here, and that's why we had to take urgent action. And the thing that Douglas can't hide behind is the very fact that people can think it's believable that the Prime Minister may have said that is in itself a damning indictment on the Prime Minister. But there's something much more...
So do you believe the Prime Minister's lying?
Well, I let other people judge that. But
what do you think?
Well, all I'm saying is his character would suggest he's not above making that kind of comment. But the important point is this is a clear fault line in our politics in Scotland, where we have failure after failure in Scotland, but it's easier for Nicola Sturgeon to point at Douglas Ross and the Tories and say, at least we're not as bad as that lot. And that demonstrates why we need to have both a better opposition in Scotland, but also, frankly, a better government so we can confront the issues that the people of Scotland face.
Willie, Rennie.
Yeah, it's utterly depressing that we have competing claims of sleaze and contacts and money. When we see the scenes in India, it's a tragedy unfolding, and it should put everything into context. It should sober us up. And that's why I think we don't want to spend the next 5 years arguing about independence. We want to focus on the recovery and trying to get this country back into a fit shape. We've seen over the last 5 days bitter arguments over borders, over currency, over the European Union. I think we should be focusing on the recovery and the things that benefit people in their daily lives. And the current argument in Scottish politics with these two does not help. We need to focus on trying to get this country back on track. But it's utterly depressing. In fact, it's grotesque that we have these competing claims of sleaze when so many people are suffering.
Patrick Harvie, do you accept that Nicola Sturgeon has answered all the questions? Or, I mean, have you given them a free pass because you agree on independence?
We certainly haven't done that. The reality is that the allegations on the ministerial code found that there wasn't a breach in Scotland, whereas in Boris Johnson's case, he's someone who kept his Home Secretary in office, even when she had been.
But there was a terrible failure of the complainants in that case, which still hasn't been addressed.
Absolutely, and I think there are members of the Parliamentary Committee who clearly breached the confidence of the witnesses, the original complainants, and that has to be investigated by the new Parliament. But look, everybody, or most people here, I think, have said it's depressing that this stench of sleaze is what our election might be about. I don't think our election has to be about that. Yes, I know a lot of people, hear this kind of stuff about the Westminster government, and they're not very surprised. I think there's a rock bottom level of confidence in the Westminster government in Scotland. But the election that we have right now is about giving people in Scotland the option to choose between two possible paths for our country. One, as a small independent country trying to get back into Europe, or the other is as part of Boris Johnson's Brexit Britain. And if we're looking to tackle the climate emergency, the inequality in our society, the COVID recovery, we need to give the people
let's get in this. I'm going to
choice.
come to you now, Anna Sawa, because I think that's enough sleaze discussion for right now. Let's talk about the Constitution and these big issues and the big choice ahead of the Scottish people. If you are pro-union in Scotland, Anna Sawa, the truth is you should vote you should vote Conservative, shouldn't you? Because 40% of your party would quite like an independence referendum, and many of your candidates too.
Look, Christian, I don't accept the premise of the question. Actually, it links to the first question, because what this election can't be about is what matters to politicians. This election's got to be about people out there, their families, the local communities, and having a national recovery. I'm not willing to accept that I'm only going to put forward a programme that speaks to the half of the country that agrees with me on the Constitution. We need a recovery that works for everyone. And I say directly to people, I don't care if you voted yes, no, leave and remain. I will work with anyone
the union
to make
is
Scotland a
at stake
fair and more equal place.
And so in terms of unionist looking for a party to save the union, it's him, isn't it?
No.
Who's going to save the union, not you.
Well, I'll say directly, you've heard it right at the top of this programme today. The biggest threat to the United Kingdom is Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. But you can choose something different. We can actually make a change and choose to focus on what unites us as a country, not what divides us, recognising that we have come through a crisis together. Do we really want to come through this crisis and go back to politicians arguing with each other, arguing about their own interest, not the national interest?
I respect your desire to say, let's come together, but you end up in a position which is exactly the same as the Tories in saying to the other half of Scotland, there is no democratic path to your political aspirations. If there is a democratic path to an independence referendum, what is it? Do you support a referendum if that's what Scotland votes for by majority?
I think you're giving a false choice to people. What you're saying to people is, put your recovery on hold, put the jobs and the economy on hold, put the education catch-up on hold,
he asked you a direct question.
missed cancer diagnoses on hold.
Let's have the power to make it real.
And instead focus on a referendum. I think we should focus on a recovery.
Christian, look, I've spent almost every waking moment for the past 12 months, more than that now, trying to steer this country through COVID. And for as long as it takes, if I'm re-elected as First Minister, that is what I will do. Nothing matters more than that. But once we're out of this crisis, it is a case of who decides what kind of country Scotland is and what our future is. Is it the people of Scotland, or is it Boris Johnson? And we've just heard the downsides of that. And when politicians like Annas and Douglas and Willie say we don't want a referendum, to allow the Scottish people to decide the future, then what they're effectively saying is that they want to decide Scotland's future, and the views of the majority
we don't want this referendum. We don't want this referendum because Nicola Sturgeon...
That's the democratic problem at the heart of their argument.
We don't want this referendum because Nicola Sturgeon will take her eye off the ball again. She accepted in this venue last week.
What if the people want a referendum?
Well, I'm sorry, we are speaking about 14 years of failure from the SNP and taking their eye off the ball. Because at stake at this election is securing Scotland's recovery, rebuilding after the pandemic. The SNP and Nicola Sturgeon have explained that they would hold that referendum during our recovery phase when we should be protecting jobs, improving our educational standards, investing in the NHS, and all of that is at risk with the SNP who would take us through another...
What is your definition of when the recovery is done? When would it be OK to hold a referendum?
Well, the Institute of Fiscal Studies has said it will take years for Scotland's economy to get back to pre-pandemic levels. But people should not be surprised that the leader of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party does not want to have another referendum.
So there's never
on
a
Scottish
time.
independence.
Whether or not
and what we got from Anna
independent
Sauer
shouldn't be up to Douglas or Annas or Willie or Patrick or me. It should be up to the people of Scotland. Now, people can judge for themselves where my focus has been over these past 12 months. But
your eyes been off the ball.
We talk about recovery as if it's some kind of neutral concept. What kind of recovery do we want? What kind of country do we want to recover
jobs.
to? Is it one based on the values of Scotland? Or is it one in the image of Boris? That's the fundamental question.
Nicola, the last time the independents consumed this country, you took your eye off the ball on one of the most important issues, and that is drug deaths in Scotland. We have now got one of the highest drug deaths in Europe. In fact, the modern world. It's 3.5 times higher than England. And your Justice Secretary at the time admitted you did not deal with the issue because it would get in the way, in the way of independence. That is exactly what will happen over the next 5 years if this country allows you to take your eye off the ball again. And the difference will be...
This country is voting in an election next week, and all I'm saying is we should respect the outcome of that election. What is it about democracy you find so hard to accept?
Will you respect the outcome of democracy? I mean, Anna Sauer never answered the question about what happens if the people of Scotland vote for parties who are in favour of a referendum. If they do, will you respect that?
I will take my instructions from the people who vote for me in my constituency. And I am very clear.
So hang the majority.
I am putting forward my platform that I do not favour another independence referendum because I want
you may not respect the will of the people.
Because I want to put recovery first. And it's democratic to say, do exactly what you say you're going to do in the election campaign. It would be bizarre if I changed my mind afterwards.
Douglas Ross, is the union voluntary? Is it a meeting of two sides? One side leave?
It is the most powerful and successful economic and political union that the world has ever seen. And we've seen through the last 12 months...
Is it voluntary?
We've seen through the last 12 months how the Union of the United Kingdom has protected jobs here in Scotland. Over 1 million people were protected through the furlough and self-employed.
Can anyone leave?
I don't want anyone to leave the family of 4 nations. Well, we've had a referendum where the people of Scotland...
Is it possible to leave the union?
It would have, of course it is, because it would have been possible in 2014 when the SNP asked people to support their plans to separate Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom, and people said no. And what we've heard again from Nicola Sturgeon tonight, sorry, if I can just finish, what we've heard again from Nicola Sturgeon tonight is she would put our recovery from this pandemic that has harmed so many individuals and families. It's not rubbish, Nicola Sturgeon. You're threatening our recovery.
I want to get to the bottom of this. You said how it was possible in 2014.
And I don't want to see that again.
How is it possible now in 2021?
I don't want to see that again because I want to secure a recovery and rebuilding Scotland.
After that referendum,
how is it possible?
After that referendum in 2014, your party signed up, as we all did, to the Smith Commission, which was intended to develop devolution within the UK, a strengthened Scottish Parliament. And in that report, you also signed up to the conclusion that said nothing in it will prevent the people of Scotland from being able to choose independence if that's their wish. So if the people of Scotland are allowed to choose, how may they choose?
Christian, this debate proves why Scotland does face a choice. And of course it's Scotland's right to choose its own future. I accept that. But this exact argument shows what the choices are in this election. Do we really want the next Parliament to be an extension of these arguments? Frankly, this circus for the next 5 years.
We will get to the other issues, but we are talking about the Constitution now. If you don't want to talk about that, it's fine. You can sit it out, and the rest of us will...
It's not about sitting it out. It's about choosing something different.
Patrick Harvie, what should happen if Boris Johnson refuses to give a referendum to Scotland if Scotland elects a parliament in which a majority of MSPs want a referendum?
Well, if he does, I think it will clearly push more and more people towards supporting independence. The UK simply saying, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't, will guarantee more and more people saying, yes, we will. And Boris Johnson...
Yeah, but what happens?
Boris Johnson will not be there forever. If you look at today's news, he may not be there very much longer. And the UK government is going to have to accept the basic democratic principle. As I've just reminded Douglas, they signed up to after the 2014
he may well win the next
referendum.
UK election. You could be waiting 10 years.
Well, I don't think that'll happen.
What are you going to do?
The longer they dig their heels in and say Scotland's not allowed to choose, the more people will say, yes, we're going to.
Nicola Sturgeon, can you answer that question? What happens?
Firstly, I don't think that's what will happen. You don't have to listen too closely to the noises out of Westminster right now to know that the Tories have already moved on to thinking how they block a referendum.
Question, Nicola.
Douglas, I'm about to answer the question. Maybe if you listen, you'll learn something. To sort of debates about how they rig the franchise and how they
you want the question
rig the
again,
timing
you've not
of
answered it yet.
But if Boris Johnson decides to stand in the way, Patrick's right, it will push more people towards independence. But he would have to ultimately take the Scottish Government to court to stop that, because we would seek to progress.
Go ahead with it anyway.
We would seek to progress legislation for a legal referendum. And if Boris Johnson accepted that, by definition, that's a legal referendum. And if he didn't want to accept that, he would have to...
So you would hold an illegal referendum? You would go ahead?
No, I would not hold an illegal referendum. I have never argued that. Well, I've always said...
You disagree with Richard Thompson?
I don't know what you're quoting there, Douglas.
Richard Thompson is one of Nicola Sturgeon's SNP MPs.
I will speak for myself. Anybody who's listened will see I have always argued for a legal, legitimate process, because that's the only way to get an independence vote recognised. But the idea and the fact that we're standing here talking about what happens if a Tory Prime Minister decides to block Scottish democracy shows you how absurd this is. Now, let me repeat again, my focus is getting this country through COVID. It's getting our recovery underway, but it's also about saying to people, as a matter of basic democratic principle, whether or not Scotland becomes independent is a choice for the people of Scotland. It's not a choice for me or for any of the other politicians here. What is it about that principle of democracy that people find so difficult to accept?
Willie, Rennie, for a long time, the Liberal Democrats' #1 issue had been Brexit, and you still want to rejoin the European Union, don't you? Isn't your best route to that through Scottish independence? Why are you a unionist?
For goodness sake, no.
He's given up on EU membership.
We should learn the lessons of Brexit, not repeat them with independence. Breaking up long-term economic partnerships is chaotic. We've seen that. The effect on the fishermen, Northern Ireland, on Dover. This is a massive lesson that we need to learn. We would have exactly the same problems with independence. I mean, the European Union, 40 years old? And it was really difficult to break from it. Just imagine how difficult it would be to break up the United Kingdom, which has been here for 300 years. I'm not in favour of adding chaos onto chaos. Of course, I want to rejoin the European Union. I want to persuade people over time. But the priority has got to be,
Scotland are already persuaded,
to focus on putting recovery first. I want to get the education system back up and running again. I want to make sure we cut mental health rates. I want to create jobs for people. All that they want to do is to focus on the assumption that they're going to win this election, which I think is extremely arrogant.
One of the issues...
Let's try and put it to the voters first.
One of the issues that Brexit brought up was the question of the border. The border's become a hot topic this week, hasn't it, Nicola Sturgeon, because friction at the border, if Scotland was to rejoin the European Union, would cost the country in trade. So how much would it cost? You don't know, do you?
Well, we will put all of that before the people of Scotland before we ask them to choose independence.
But there is a cost, you accept that?
Well, Brexit has already created borders. Our businesses right now are paying the price of that. Our exporting businesses have lost tens of millions of pounds. The question is how we manage these things to maximise our trading opportunities, not minimise our trading opportunities.
But any new friction means more costs,
We prepare and we make sure that complying with the rules of EU membership don't make life difficult for our businesses. But the benefit of being independent in Europe is that we open up free trade again across 27 other countries, the world's biggest single market. Brexit is all about narrowing our horizons.
That's really smart.
Independence is about expanding those horizons again. And of course, for people, because an independent Scotland, and nobody argues against this, would be in the common travel area. So an independent Scotland would give people not just the continued right to freedom of movement across the common travel area, but the right of freedom of movement across the whole of the
This is a consequence of Brexit.
A win-win position.
Scotland does 60% of its trade with the rest of the United Kingdom, and that's the biggest market for Scottish businesses
more
and for
manufactured
protecting
goods to the
Scottish
rest of
jobs.
the world
But
than
Nicola
we do to the rest of the
Sturgeon couldn't recall what her own MP had said over holding an illegal independence referendum. Can't she recall what her MSP Emma Harper said last week about a hard border would create success and would be good for Scotland? Do you agree with Emma Harper?
You can stand here, Douglas, and you can misquote people for the rest of the
Emma Harper said a hard border would create jobs. Do you agree?
I've been campaigning with Emma Harper today.
Do you agree with her?
We want trade to continue across the Scotland and England border, but we also want Scotland
So was she wrong to say a hard border would create jobs?
Douglas, and see, instead of
Yes or no?
Instead of misquoting other people,
Emma Harper
why don't you try to put forward any kind of positive case for the people of Scotland?
We are still in a pandemic, Christian, I'll just remind people.
To offer the people of Scotland, which is why
we are still in a pandemic, Christian.
Constant negativity.
We are still in a pandemic, Christian. I would just remind people on the stage.
I don't need reminding of that.
We are still in a pandemic.
Anas.
I'm sorry, but sometimes you do need reminded of it. Because 10,000 of our fellow citizens have lost their lives, and all you've had for 20 minutes so far is politicians bickering in a studio when there are people whose lives and livelihoods are still at risk. Do we really want to be having these arguments about borders, about currency, denying LSE reports or denying other expert reports? I don't pick and choose when I quote an expert's report. We can't pick and choose when it was around Brexit. We can't pick and choose when it was around independence. Let's instead really focus on what brings our country back together again. Would you not rather that Nicola Sturgeon and I were working together on ending child poverty rather than arguing about borders?
The trouble is, when you want to talk about other policies, the Institute for Fiscal Studies say your manifesto doesn't add up.
Yeah, so it criticised all of the parties on the stage.
Yes, and it says you're not honest about the tax rises or the cuts you would need to bring in for all your aspirations.
But Christian, unlike other political parties, I'll accept the criticism.
But the problem is
some of us...
So you accept your manifesto doesn't add up?
No, I accept the criticism. What I would say in the caveat is that what we published was a two-part manifesto. One was the immediate recovery plan for the first year and first phase of the recovery. And the second part is long-term ambitions, which go beyond the next Parliament. But I'm not going to do what other people on the stage do, which is choose to quote the IFS when it suits them, for example, when talking about Brexit, but choose to ignore the IFS when it talks about independence or this election campaign. It's exactly what Nicola Sturgeon does. It's exactly what Douglas Ross does.
For Anas, the difference between me and Anas is not just that we have different opinions on independence, but he wants to make the decision for people. I want to let
people are choosing in this election campaign.
And we talked about working together on child poverty. I'd be delighted to work with anybody here on tackling child poverty. My government introduced the Scottish Child Payment to do that. But as we lift children out of poverty, we have a Westminster Tory government plunging kids into poverty.
You can't always blame somebody else.
I'm taking responsibility, but I don't want to have one hand.
Hang on.
I don't want to have one hand.
How many children in Scotland live in poverty?
Fewer children live in poverty in Scotland than in any other part of the UK.
So that's okay then?
No, it's not okay.
So how many children in Scotland live in poverty?
24% of children in Scotland are in poverty.
How many in your constituency live in poverty?
You've misquoted
How many in your children live in poverty?
You've misquoted that before.
48% of children in your constituency
I think you'll
live
find the
in
last
poverty.
time you used that statistic, Anas, you were fact-checked by the BBC and found not
true.
Correct. But look, child poverty is too high. It's lowered in Scotland because of the actions we can take, but it is too high because of the actions we can't take, because of welfare cuts being imposed against our will. All I'm saying is that Scotland would not be perfect. We're not perfect. We would face our challenges. But trying to confront those challenges with one hand tied behind our back is not the best way to do it. Let's give ourselves all of the powers and all of the resources.
The problem is, Nicola, that you were granted £3 billion of welfare powers back in the Smith Commission.
Absolutely.
And you delayed the implementation of those powers because you couldn't get it ready on time. So complaining about other governments and their performance, when you've not taken responsibility yourself to solve the problem, I think is a neglect.
And therefore you should not...
Okay, answer that.
Social Security Scotland, a new agency set up, administers 10 welfare benefits now. 7 of them don't exist anywhere else in the UK because that's what
we do have power.
With and we are using
it. We do have power.
Yes, and we are using
so let's focus on what we can do.
As we do that, we are dragged back by a Tory government taking us in the wrong direction.
When it comes to policy that you could extract, that you could get from the SNP, why are you not doing more to try and get more on your big agenda, which is climate change? Why are you not getting them to accelerate their transition away from fossil fuels to renewables in return for support in the Parliament?
We've done a huge amount. The green impact in the last session of the Scottish Parliament does include fairer taxes that's helped to fund local services. It's included a policy that's coming in later this year on free bus travel for young people.
So if you hold the balance,
energy
what will you ensure
marine environment,
that Nicola Sturgeon delivers?
I would take the issue of fossil fuels as a really good example of where we can go further right now a little bit by not having Scottish Government supporting the fossil fuel industry in the way that it does. But the licensing of fossil fuels is an example of why we need the powers of independence, because that's held at Westminster. There are probably 3 times more fossil fuels in the North Sea than we can afford to use, and yet they're still issuing licenses to go looking for more of the stuff. This is a dead-end industry, and the communities in Scotland that are currently relying on it, what they need is investment in the alternative.
But will you say there is a quid pro quo?
Public transport, restoring nature. That's the agenda that will create the jobs and prosperity of the future.
As you did in the previous Parliament, you know, you could extract something for that. You could say, you have to deliver this policy of ours in order to get our support on the referendum.
That's exactly what we've done. We have a huge list of impacts, from public transport to energy efficiency to the marine environment, and yes, to fair taxation as well, to help fund local services. The reason why high-income individuals pay more tax in Scotland is because of green pressure. And the report just out today that talks about the deficit in Scotland, one of the clear things that it concludes is that there's got to be a role for wealth taxes. Well, now the Greens are the only ones in this election putting out a detailed plan for how we can implement a wealth tax to close wealth inequality, which is every bit as socially divisive and damaging as income inequality. We can do that so that we can invest in the warm homes, the public transport, restoring nature. That's the agenda for the future, not the fossil fuel.
Let's come to you next, and I know you want to talk about policy, but one of the reasons this is difficult is because you don't really believe you're going to be the First Minister after the election, do you?
Well, look,
so your manifesto is just pie in the sky.
Look, I'm being what is probably rare in politics. I'm being honest with people. I became leader 8 weeks ago. When I became leader, we were at 14% in the polls. I would love to be First Minister in just 9 or 10 days' time, but I'm being honest that I am taking the Labour Party on a journey. That journey is not complete. There is still change to happen in the Labour Party, but I'm asking people to support me in this election campaign so we can have a parliament that focuses on the issues that matter to people. But just on...
Well, before we get... I'll let you do that, but hands up anyone else who thinks realistically they will be First Minister.
We absolutely have to get rid of an
Is that a hand up?
We have to get rid of an SNP government that has failed Scotland. There is an opportunity at this election for people to get rid of an SNP government that has failed Scotland.
Is that your hand up, that you believe you will be First Minister?
I would love to be First Minister of Scotland.
I'm not asking you that.
I would love to be First Minister of Scotland to see an end of the division.
Someone who believes every word Boris Johnson says.
What Nicola Sturgeon has done to our educational standards, to our NHS, to our economy, that we should be protecting jobs, and you can
and the trouble is,
as much as you want Nicola Sturgeon.
Nicola Sturgeon is the only one here playing to win. The rest of you are all playing different games.
Christian, I think politics sometimes does still suffer, even in Scotland, from the winner-takes-all mentality at Westminster. A lot of other small, independent Northern European countries that Scotland likes to, well, many people in Scotland like to aspire to being, have a pluralistic, multi-party democracy. They've had that for decades, and the result is that politicians do have to find common ground, work together in the national interest. That is normal in a lot of other European countries, and I think we can achieve that here if we raise our
Douglas Ross, let's talk about your manifesto for a second as well, because the IFS also said your manifesto doesn't add up, and worse than that, you're trying to promise tax cuts while also promising spending increases.
It is the only manifesto from any of the parties that has been costed, and we've outlined the cost of our policies and how that would be funded. It's the manifesto which the IFS has said is the most generous to our NHS over the course of the next Parliament, and it is a manifesto rooted in recovery and rebuilding Scotland.
Why cut the
because we want
taxes
to
for Scotland's
invest
richest?
in jobs. We want to
Why
invest
won't you be
in
honest
infrastructure.
about which
We want to
taxes-
invest in our NHS. We are saying we can do all of these things if we can get a Parliament laser focused on recovery and rebuilding,
Well,
not
Scotland's
one
richest
on
to
another
get a tax
referendum.
cut.
You don't want to
Thousands
focus
of
on
pounds a
recovery,
tax cut
Douglas.
for the
I
richest.
absolutely want to. Don't start that. I want the focus to be on recovery. I want the focus to be on protecting jobs all over Scotland. I want the focus to be on raising our educational standards across Scotland. Because after 14 years, Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP have let down the next generation of young people. And this is really important. We have an opportunity to have a Parliament focused on recovery, not on divisional arguments in the past.
Just on that, you've quoted a few MSPs and politicians today. I know Tory MSPs who privately say they like the debate about the Constitution. They like the debate about the referendum because the only way they get Tory MSPs elected is to talk about the division and sound like there is a big division happening and they've got to stop a referendum.
Well, you should maybe,
You're not interested in a recovery because you can't deliver a recovery that works for everyone across our country.
You should maybe listen to the Tories about getting elected because the Scottish Labour Party have lost votes in MSPs at every single election since devolution.
Nicola Sturgeon.
I'm possibly the only person on this panel right now that doesn't take the outcome of next week's election for granted. I'm campaigning for every vote, but I am also the only person that is putting forward a prospectus that is serious about governing this country. We live in the most serious times any of us have ever known. This country deserves a person who's putting forward a serious plan to be First Minister and a government that is serious about leading us through COVID, kick-starting our recovery and making sure...
You're also the person whose track record can be judged, whose track record on whether you did put education first, whether the attainment gap has been closed, whether the drugs death was tackled,
Let me take...
whether, you know...
We need a Parliament for everyone.
When you took your eye off the ball. All of those things can be judged as well, can't they?
People of Scotland will judge me and the SNP on all of these things a week on Thursday. That's what elections are about. But you take education, for example. My manifesto 5 years ago promised progress on reducing the attainment gap. We have reduced the attainment gap.
You are kidding.
Level 5.
You are kidding.
No, I'm sorry,
It's
Willie,
as
that
wide
the
as
facts,
it's ever
that the
been.
facts don't
For
suit you.
goodness
But at
sake.
level 5, it's reduced by a third. At level 6, by a fifth. We've got record numbers of young people from deprived communities right now going into university. We have virtually
How long will it take to close the attainment
early
gap?
years. Look, we will continue. We have plans to invest. No, it will not take 35
years. It will take 35 years. At
We are
this
going
rate
to
of progress,
continue to make
35
that
years.
progress over the next parliamentary term. And when we do it, we will become the first country anywhere in the world to close the poverty-related attainment gap. We've virtually doubled early years education, giving our young people the best start in life. I don't shy away from the areas where we need to do better. Drugs deaths is one of them, an area where we have tried, but we've not done...
And you can't blame the pandemic for that, can you? You've taken your eye off the ball a long time
I have
before
been
that.
candid about this. We have tried to tackle drugs deaths. It's not because we haven't done the things that we have thought were right, but we haven't done well enough. So I'm putting before the Scottish people my track record, but also being candid about the things where I think we need to do
Right,
better.
but the place you're not being candid...
doing that.
Let's concentrate on where you're not being candid, and that is on your central policy, which is the impact of independence. You have offered no economic analysis. You say it's far too soon, yet you're asking people to embark down a road in electing you that will lead to an independence referendum and an independence campaign. Surely this is a dishonest way of going about it.
No, it's not, because a year ago, when the pandemic struck, I said openly that I was putting all planning for an independence referendum on hold to allow me to focus on the pandemic. So no, we haven't done.
So delay the referendum.
We haven't done the analysis.
If you've put everything on hold, why haven't you said we better put the referendum on hold?
I'm not planning a referendum immediately. I've said
just in the recovery phase. Just in the recovery phase. That's fine.
The right to choose. And just as we did in 2014, completely different to the Brexit referendum, we put forward a prospectus saying what independence meant, what the challenges would be. We will do that again when we're asking people.
So, Christian, Nicola Sturgeon...
That's the right, and I will take no lessons on informed choices for somebody from the party of the Brexit referendum, frankly.
Nicola Sturgeon has just confirmed that she will set out the plans to hold another independence referendum if the SNP get a majority before that is held. She has also accepted that another independence referendum could be held in the first 2 years. So when we should be focused on recovery and rebuilding, Nicola Sturgeon has just accepted government officials' time and resources will be spent drafting up a case for another independence referendum. That is reckless. It will put jobs at risk. It will put our recovery at risk.
Don't think
it is typical of the SNP.
I put independence referendum planning
over the
on
national
hold.
interest.
I will focus on the pandemic for as long as it takes. When I put,
you said it will be in the recovery
planning
phase
for the referendum on hold to focus on the pandemic, what did Boris Johnson do? He ploughed ahead.
Nicola Sturgeon
You've refused to define what the recovery phase is. Can you define when the recovery's done?
I think
when is it okay?
I think we should devote the next 5 years to the recovery, because I think it will take longer than that, but it will take at least 5 years.
What is the definition of recovery?
I think it's when we've got people back into jobs, when we've cut the mental health weights right back down, because it's over 1,500 young people wait over a year.
So what point?
I think it's the attainment gap. I think that has to be closed significantly. And I think we need to deal with the climate emergency, which is a rather substantial issue.
So when we've dealt with the climate emergency, that's when Scotland can have
I think we should be well on the path to that.
Really is a false choice. This is an incredible moment in history, actually. The opportunity to rebuild an economy and a society from the pandemic is an opportunity to ask questions about the kind of society we want to be on a scale that hasn't happened since the Second World War. And the generation after the Second World War laid foundations that meant that for decades after that, the UK became gradually more equal. Now, that legacy has been ripped up by successive UK governments since the 1980s. But we have this extraordinary opportunity. I don't think you can separate out the question of COVID recovery from the question of power in our society and our economy. We've got an opportunity for extraordinary change if we only let the people of Scotland choose.
Patrick, you can't pretend that independence or a referendum is some kind of light switch moment that doesn't take time, doesn't take distraction. You can look at the chaos of Brexit, and I actually agree with Nicola Sturgeon.
It will be a journey, and let's embark on it.
It was reckless for Boris Johnson to plough ahead with Brexit, particularly in the midst of a pandemic. I actually agree with her. But that took 4.5 years of chaos. The idea we say to people, it's okay, we've come through this greatest of challenge in our lifetimes, and it will be a simple light switch moment and won't take time to get back to where we were, is simply not acceptable and not true.
The alternative is to say that we can address poverty and inequality, that we can address the climate and nature emergency as part of Boris Johnson's Brexit.
Just lastly, let's talk very briefly about the kind of country this country is going to feel like under different representatives here. Douglas Ross, there was a story today in the newspapers, I wonder if you could clarify it. It said that you were against equal marriage in 2014 and that you would have voted against it. Now, that was something that made your predecessor, Ruth Davidson, cry with joy, that she was so pro-equal marriage. Were you against equal marriage in 2014?
I've said in a debate in Murray Council Chamber that there was a passionate, engaged debate on both sides, and I was balancing both sides of the argument because many constituents had contacted me about it.
Did you say you'd have voted against it?
At the time, I would have voted against it, just like two of Nicola Sturgeon's government ministers voted against it. But I have also said that I fully support it, and I think marriage is a thing of beauty both for men and women and people of same sex, and it's something we should support.
We've gone back to the same old Tories. The cuddly Tories under Ruth Davidson are well and truly gone. There's a reason why Ruth Davidson has walked away. Because we've got Brexit, we've got chaos, we've got division, and not only is Douglas talking about same-sex marriage, he's already had to apologise for hateful views against other minority communities in Scotland. We're back to the same old Tories, and frankly, we deserve better.
If we are in another 2 years of division and argument, how are you going to keep the tone right that doesn't turn this country on itself?
And I think it's incumbent upon us all to make that happen, because the debate in Scotland just now is toxic. I have to say, over the last year, through the pandemic, I found politics quite a fruitful enterprise. We managed to work together to deal with some of the massive challenges that we faced. And it was one of the upsides of the pandemic, one of the few upsides. But as soon as Nicola brought forward the independence bill again, then the whole thing fell apart. And that's what it's going to be like for the next 5 years.
Nicola Sturgeon, after the last referendum, so many people said this country had turned on itself and families had fallen out. How are you going to avoid that over the next 2 years as you start this again?
That wasn't my experience of 2014, but I respect that that was the experience of other people. But settling disagreements democratically for any country is not divisive. Politicians trying to dictate to people what the future should be, I think that is more divisive. You ask what kind of country I want to be First Minister of, an open, inclusive, welcoming, tolerant country where we build greater fairness and equality here at home and play our full constructive part across Europe and the world. That's my vision of Scotland. I'll do everything I can if I'm re-elected as First Minister of a devolved government to bring that about. Use all the powers
If only
and
Nicola Sturgeon had
That's what I want.
That's my view.
Our time is up.
Future can be empowering.
Our time is up, I'm afraid, but thank you all very much indeed for joining us. I hope that has been fascinating if you live in England and useful if you live in Scotland. The country votes next week. The ramifications could be huge. Until tomorrow, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.